Hi, this is Scott Miller. Welcome to my Top Performance blog. Today, I have the honor of speaking with a person that I consider a friend and a colleague. He is a full professor at the University of Denver in the Department of Psychology, Jesse Owen. He's also the incoming editor of one of my favorite APA journals, a place that I published a bit before, I think maybe together with you, Jesse, even.
I think so.
Article or two, Division 29's journal called Psychotherapy. It really is one of the most practical and scholarly journals that APA puts out. Hi, Jesse.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me.
And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me on what I think is a really important and mostly timely subject. The country that we live in and much of the world is undergoing a seismic event. We've had the coronavirus move in and really change day-to-day living. At the same time, it's also made many people aware of existing inequalities as well as cultural differences that heretofore haven't been appreciated, how some people stand on the outside of the dominant culture. And this is a subject that I know affects clinical work, and you are the person that's been doing a great deal of research on culture in psychotherapy. And so, what do we know, Jesse, about culture?
That's a great intro to a lot of the things that I think about on a daily basis. And, recent events have highlighted it for a number of people who are just coming around to understanding these inequalities.
Yeah.
Folks like myself and other people of color and other marginalized individuals have been living this for many, many generations. In terms of psychotherapy, there are not a lot of studies out there looking at common processes, cultural processes in psychotherapy. And so let me describe a little bit of what this landscape looks like and what do we know. So through the movements of the empirically supported treatments and this kind of manualized approach, a number of researchers started to try to do some adaptations to those manuals for different cultural groups. And they were kind of pan-ethnic groups. So it'd be like CBT for African Americans or CBT for Asian Americans, not really drilling down a ton in terms of like the differences and those different groups, but just understanding some of the cultural norms within that. That approach, in some ways, brings us into the fold of the traditional RCT world, which, for better or for worse, we can debate that on a different day. But I think the interesting thing to me from just a practitioner standpoint, because I do have a private practice, is that the intersectionality of identities wasn't fully accounted for in a lot of those types of treatments. And so just thinking about what would that look like to develop manuals for all the various intersectionalities is daunting, right? So like, would we have a different version of CBT for Black gay men and a different version of CBT for Black trans men? Like, you could just imagine just the unfolding number of different treatment considerations.
It becomes unwieldy, especially if you think how many differences can any one person be aware of and accommodate.
Absolutely, yeah. It's not practical. I always think about my work as like, would I do this in my own practice? Like, how would I go about implementing this in my own practice? And so then so one of the interesting things that came from this, and this is from Huey's meta-analyses on these adapted treatments, is that, if you adapt these treatments with a very strong explicit focus on the differences, there's actually negative outcomes. But if you tailor the treatments with a more implicit, kind of interwoven throughout the treatments, there's actually good outcomes.
Okay, now, wait a second. What the hell are you talking about? So if you do this based on explicit categories, then there's likely to be more negative outcomes. And then the second piece was something about implicit and interwoven. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so let me give you some practical some suggestions that came from some of the work that was included in this meta. There was an RCT done where the very first session, the therapist said, I'm white, you're black, how is this going to work? And that is just so unnatural. And if you think about clients who are coming into treatment, they're in pain, and their ethnicity might not even be a central part of what they want to talk about. And so by naming it so explicitly, it can kind of catch somebody off guard. And so like, I think those types of interventions, and that study interestingly found no differences in treatment outcomes for doing those explicit kind of statements up front. And so I think about that from a real practical standpoint. What do we want therapists to do? And in my mind, we want therapists to engage in conversations around race or other cultural identities in a way that they would naturally talk to another human being. And so that kind of natural process is more on what the implicit adaptations are, right? So how do you include a discussion on values?
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand this right. Initially, some of the way we approached this subject was in a way similar to a diagnostic code, except for instead of mental disorders, we put race and the various identities. And somehow or other, initially the idea was, well, peg where that person is, and then once you've done that, you can apply the appropriate care for that.
Right.
And you're saying not so fast.
Right. And also, I mean, you can imagine this to be true about pretty much anything. As people start to learn a manual, that feels a little bit different when you're talking about culture than when it does talking about depression. Right? There is no manual for my identities, right? Like as a biracial guy, and definitely white passing at times, that intersection, those being male, white passing, and being biracial is a very unique experience to me. And to think that a therapist is going to have a manual for how to treat me seems a little bit dehumanizing in some ways.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've been suggesting to folks is to look at more process-based approaches to understanding culture. And so myself and Karen Tao and a team of about 14 or 15 researchers now are looking at a model that we call multicultural orientation. And we use the word framework, not model, because it's not a model of psychotherapy. It's a framework that can be integrated into any form of treatment.
Right. So when clients are rating them higher on the variables that you've identified as this multicultural orientation framework, then you're seeing superior outcomes as mediated by better working relationships.
Yes. And we found that the correlation between those and therapy outcomes was explaining around 5 to 8% of the variance. And so to put that in context, right, that's about the same amount of variance as empathy, working alliance, goal consensus, and all those other empirically supported relationship variables that John and Norcross and Bruce Wampold have talked about years. So the framework includes 3 pillars. One, which is really focused on the therapist, which is cultural humility. So this idea of being other-oriented, to be curious, to be non-judgmental about other people's cultural identities. When judgment comes up, that's when humility is important, right?
Say that again and help me understand that.
Yeah, when you start to feel the judgment meter rise in your therapist's brain, that's when humility matters. It doesn't matter when you're just connecting. And so when you're asking, like, what's that difference? What's the thing? I think it's those moments when you're like hearing a client say something, like the client could be saying anything that's value laden, right? And if you're like starting to be like, oh, I don't like that opinion, I don't like that way of thinking, that's when you really need to engage this idea of like, okay, I don't know enough about this for this person, right? Like therapy is such a brief interaction, given the totality of life, that we just don't know a lot about what's going on.
And I probably should lean in at that point.
You can't question them. You can only ask questions of them. Right? And so I think like those kinds of...
It's an interesting distinction, even that, Jesse. You can't question them. You can ask questions of them.
Absolutely.
It demonstrates a stance on your part that you're not trying to undermine their beliefs.
Right.
You're instead trying to understand and get closer.
Absolutely. Because that's what humility is really about. of course you can debate somebody, but if you're really open to feedback, you really need to hear somebody. And and understand that any one person's journey is going to look different than somebody else's. But like those stories help build a picture that might be different than the judgment in the mind.
Mm.
The second pillar is cultural opportunities, which is talking about culture in a way that works with the client. So a good example of what we talk about is session markers. And I had a client one time who was very religious, lost a family member, and in that session, she was very depressed. And in that session, she said, you know, I can't go to church anymore. How would God do this to me? Why would they take this family member? Right? All pure, genuine reactions for sure. And then she continued on in that same sentence and talked about how this is really spiraling her loneliness and spiraling her depression. And her last statement in that exchange was, and I've never thought about killing myself, but now I am. And so a lot to unpack in that one statement, for sure. But the session marker is I could have either quickly zoned in on suicide ideation and the symptoms and the loneliness, but I chose to talk about her relationship with God and why is she disappointed in him and how she would talk about it and what does her faith mean to her. So up to that point, we really didn't talk about that spiritual angle for her.
And tie this to the second pillar again. Help me make the connection.
Yeah, so for cultural opportunities, there's an opportunity in that statement, right? I could have focused on her religious identity, or I could have focused on symptomology, right? Mm. And I think for a lot of us, it's sometimes a difficult decision to make. And I'm not saying one way is better than the other. I circled back to the suicide ideation, of course, near the end of the session, just to make sure, you know, keeping people safe. But I think like those kind of markers happen.
And perhaps in the past, and especially I would say with religious identity, we as therapists may have shied away from that, or at least academically we've shied away from it and until of late, even though it's one of the qualities listed in APA's definition of diversity. So you're saying look for that opportunity to connect with that part of their identity.
Yeah, and so that's a great opportunity that the client created, right? She brought that material into the session, but I also encourage folks to think about ways where you can create opportunities. If you had an intake form that wasn't check boxes, are you Black, are you male, but it was open-ended, like list the identities that are most salient to you. And some people are gonna like fill that up, and this is what we do in our research. Some people fill those lines up for days. Other people just like, this isn't important to me.
Right.
Either way, that's good information to know, right? That's right. And so regardless of what your agency or your practice does, I encourage folks to think about identities as being important to the client that you might not even realize. It's sometimes hard to know what questions to ask to understand cultural identities. Like, what does that really mean to you? Mm. Right? And so I always try to encourage folks to say and ask questions around values. Like, what do you value in your life? What kinds of things like are most important to you? What types of, you know, kind of world beliefs do you have? And that is linked to people's culture, and the degree to which you want to make that explicit connection is up to you and the client. But I think just understanding the values that a client has is really it's interesting how interconnected it is to their presenting problems.
Right. Now, I don't want to get you off track here. You've named two pillars. Were there more?
There's one more, and that's cultural comfort. And so the idea here is that it's not that therapists should be comfortable all the time. And in fact, discomfort is something that probably is a signal to the therapist that maybe I should be really rethinking why I'm uncomfortable in this moment. Why is this conversation making me uncomfortable? In almost like a cultural countertransference kind of way. But the idea is that we want people to move towards a situation where they feel comfortable engaging in this dialogue with clients, because as you know, like if you're uncomfortable, the first thing that you're going to do is avoid.
Right.
And
exactly.
That's just human nature. And you know, if we think about privilege, one of the key ways that privilege perpetuates itself is information avoidance. And so when we think about information avoidance, like what are we not putting into our worldview? What are we not listening to? that information avoidance perpetuates those cycles.
Mm. And in your work, Jesse, I guess I'm shifting away from the empirical piece, but more to your experience, balancing the privilege of not having to be curious, not having to ask, versus people who may know about their privilege but are fearful. Where does your experience say most of it lies, and what do we do about the latter, this fear that we may have about bringing it up?
Yeah, these conversations are tricky, for a lot of folks, and a lot of people who are like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And
Yes.
so in our minds, like this framework is a relational framework, and having the humility to ask, like, did I say that the wrong way? Or, is that, I don't know about this. And so I'm going to ask some questions that might be ignorant. And I think some of that work needs to happen outside of the therapy room for therapists, and not place the burden on the client to kind of teach about their culture, but it's rather to be curious about their culture. What does this mean to you? Right. Right. Not coming from a stance of like, oh, I read a book about this, so now I know.
And when you say outside of the therapy room, what are the resources that you're talking about?
I think there's a lot of good books. My team is actually putting together some deliberate practice videos to work on rupture repair. And I know some other folks are moving into that realm. And I think the video piece, these short clips and just practicing what you would say, we just finished a case study doing this, and we saw improvements in humility. We saw improvements in cultural opportunities. Comfort stayed about the same from pre to post for these two therapists, but I think that there are ways where we don't have to burden people of color, minority folks, to do this work. The other piece to me is also like, what are you reading in your day-to-day life, right? This has to be like an internal motivation. It can't be just, oh, I read this book or I did these worksheets. It's a constant thing. And I think thinking about it as, what is your motivation to do this? I ask people to check their social media. How diverse is your social media? For me, I was like, oh, my social media is pretty consistent. And so then I started following like Fox News. I started following some conservative journalists just to get exposed to a different way of thinking. Not that I agree with a lot of the posts. Right. And I also think about like, what books are people reading? I just started reading How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's a good read.
It is a good read. I've been reading it too.
And so like just those kinds of things, like what documentaries are you watching? What are you being exposed to? There's a lot of great documentaries on a whole lot of different kind of identities and these kind of struggles. And so I think that there's a lot of work that we can do outside the therapy room just to be more comfortable. And then I encourage folks, who's in your inner circle, where if you say something that's, maybe a little bit far out there, that it's not going to be a relationship ruiner. It's going to be like, okay, well, let's talk about this. Let's work this out. And that's where those conversations and comfort can really get built, by having somebody say like, oh, Scott, I wish you wouldn't have said that way. I'd kind of hearing it this way. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for folks.
Sure. And in terms of training, how are we training students differently to move beyond this putting square pegs in square holes and round pegs in round holes? This is the way you accommodate differences between people.
So kind of the part of my experience, and probably was part of yours too, in some ways, that a lot of the original books on multicultural counseling had like the chapter approach. Here's chapter 1 on African Americans. Here's chapter 2 on Latinx. And we purposely use the word orientation versus competencies, because I don't understand what competencies mean in this framework, right? The traditional competency framework, which is knowledge, having the knowledge, the skills, and the awareness, isn't a bad framework, right? Like knowledge is good, awareness is good, skills, I'm not exactly sure what skills they're talking about specifically, but so that's not bad. But if you think about like the idea of being competent, that you reach some point of being competent, seems weird when, again, talking about people and their cultural identities. And it's a way of seeing the world, right? It's a way of hearing the client's story. And that's kind of the quintessential nature of what I'm hoping for people to embody. It's a way of being, not just what do I do?
Hey, Jesse, when you're in the thick of this, both in terms of training people and on the cutting edge of the research, are you hopeful?
I am actually.
Why?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm a pretty cynical person, as you know, but I think we're starting. At least I'm seeing a lot of folks doing more intense work, more intense research, and I think the movement, and I mean, even just having like 14 or 15 collaborators around the nation trying to promote some of this stuff is awesome because we need a push. So let me give you an example of like where a gap is that's kind of glaring. We have over 220, probably 250 studies on the Working Alliance. And the classic design, assess therapy outcomes at the beginning and at the end, and maybe the Working Alliance at session 3 or 4, and predict outcomes, right? That's quintessential basic study done hundreds of times.
Right.
We have 0 longitudinal studies looking at cultural processes predicting therapy outcomes. Why aren't we capturing some of these other cultural variables? Like, what is it about the research that says like, oh, I'm not studying that, right? Like we integrate things more, and I think that's going to be what we're going to see. I also think I'm optimistic because of the new technologies that we have, like around some of this videos. Like we've done videos on microaggression detection, and like can therapists actually detect when a microaggression is happening in session? So we show videos of like 10 minutes, and there's 3 pretty, I think, overt microaggressions, but there was only like, for the 3 microaggressions, less than half the therapists identified all 3. And so like, there's a lot of work to like, how do we listen? And I think some of these videos, some of these other kinds of activities, we're going to start to see better ways of training people. We're going to see better ways of understanding what's actually happening in the room. So I think there's some momentum here, which is where my optimism comes from.
Fantastic. Thanks so very much, Jesse, for talking with me today on this important subject and during this current time where many of us are becoming aware of just how little we know our neighbor and the people that we're living with in our communities around the States.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.